So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us for this month's Discover Tennessee History webinar. I'm Kira Duke with Teaching with Primary Sources at MTSU. And so just a couple things as we get started and I turn things over to our presenter for this month. So just again, a couple reminders for those of you joining us live. If you would be sure to keep your mics muted during the course of the presentation. And if you would be sure that your name is showing up with your first and last name just to help us kind of keep track of who's attending, and then also who is comments that you might make in the chat box will know who we're talking to. We do like for these sessions to be interactive. So again, if you're joining us live, feel free to go ahead and open up that chat box and introduce yourself there, and feel free to ask questions and make comments in the chat box throughout. We will be monitoring those and responding to those. So again, definitely want you to make use of that. You also have the reaction buttons that you can use throughout the course of the presentation as well. So with this series, we do have a Padlet that's available. And so if you are interested in any of the materials that are referenced today, you'll be able to find that here on the Padlet. You can also find all of the recordings from past webinars in this series, both from this school year as well as the last school year, are all there as well. And of course, you can view those for PD credit. So this month's presentation is 225 Years of Tennessee Stories, Primary Sources and Resources Celebrating the 16th State, presented by the Tennessee State Museum. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to our presenter, Christopher Grissom.
All right, thank you very much. Hi, all of you. Like Kira said, we're going to talk a little bit about basically using primary sources for the Tennessee State Museum. This year was the 225th anniversary of Tennessee statehood. So what we decided to do at the museum was highlight 100 artifacts throughout the exhibit space that we have here that we thought were important or in some way touchstone artifacts for the story of Tennessee history that are here on display. And so we kind of decided to really lean into that, what using these artifacts as primary sources and how they can be used for you guys in your classroom. So that's what we're going to go through, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into a little bit of our resources and where maybe you could find, from the State Museum at least, where you can find some of these artifacts that you could possibly use in your classroom. So let's see if I can get my screen up. All right, I'm assuming that is up now. And I'm kind of stationary in a room with motion sensitive lights, so they may go on and off as I'm going. But like I said, artifacts as primary sources. And that we wanted to highlight that because it's easy to not think of artifacts as primary sources. We do that, I do that. I get caught up thinking more in terms of images and pictures and letters and legal documents and diary entries and that kind of stuff as being your primary sources. But we want to really highlight that artifacts can fit into that same space. We don't worry about that. But why use them to study the past? Why use an artifact? Well, for one thing, if you look at the SSPs, they're in there. It tells you to use artifacts as a list of ways to gather information from a variety of sources. Those more traditional things, printed materials, graphics, pictures, media, recordings, videos, that kind of stuff are in there, but artifacts are there too. So don't forget the power of these 3D objects. And it is built into the standards that you guys are going to be teaching. But beyond social studies, the same skills that you use to kind of analyze and observe and draw conclusions about artifacts, that same process, that same thought process shows up in other subject matters. So ELA, determine or clarify the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words using phrases by using context clues, analyzing meaningful word parts, and consulting general and specialized reference materials. That's specifically talking about words, but that thought process works for artifacts. So if you are trying to get students to be a little more analytical using context clues and consulting resources and references and research material, those same steps apply to artifacts as well. So if you're just trying to get the students in that mindset or get them to practice using these skills that you might use in ELA, you can do that in your social studies lessons as well. And STEM has some things in there that tie in as well. Apply problem solving skills to critical thinking and explore STEM related real world challenges. Again, that critical thinking aspect of it. Conduct research and develop meaningful questions. That's something that we do with the artifacts, that we do with students here at the museum with artifacts, is try to get them to really think about and question these materials based on their observations. Define simple problems and scenarios, and engage in experimentation. To a certain extent, you can do that with artifacts as well. So this process, these skills that you'll use towards the artifacts, translates across multiple grade levels, multiple topics, and it really is a useful skill set to have. And honestly, looking at artifacts, a lot of that is the same as the scientific method that you may use in your STEM classes as well. But talking about artifacts and their importance in and of themselves, here's a really great quote that really tells you how important these artifacts can be. And I've got a couple of these. But if you want to tell the history of the world, a history that does not unduly privilege one part of humanity, you cannot do it through text alone, because only some of the world has ever had text, while most of the world, for most of the time, has not. There are large populations and large percentages of history that didn't write stuff down. So if all the primary sources you're using in your classroom are text-based, you are missing large parts of history. You're missing large groups of people. But artifacts can allow you to reach those other areas. So we definitely want to include more artifacts into the classroom, into you looking at history. The artifact that happens to be shown there, that is a jacket made by a Cherokee artisan that was worn on the Trail of Tears. Native Americans are one of those marginalized groups that could be skipped over if you're only using text. A large percentage of prehistoric Native American history here in Tennessee is by definition not written down. It is prehistoric. Here's another artifact from a prehistoric time period, Mississippian. And another quote, the early part of human history, more than 95% of the human story can indeed be told only in stone, for besides human and animal remains, stone objects are all that survive. So these stone objects from prehistoric periods that have managed to survive into our present to be studied, those are very important. Tennessee history, again, talking about marginalized audiences. We had a large percentage of the population that for a very long time in Tennessee, it was illegal for them to be literate. Enslaved African Americans were not allowed to learn to read and write. So again, those text-based objects, or those text-based primary sources, either miss out on large groups, or they are from the perspective of the outside. What were white people writing about enslaved African Americans during that time period? What were early European explorers writing about Native Americans when they first encountered them? Those are the things that you're looking at text from those time periods. But switching it over to look at the artifacts gives you another way into these different objects and different periods. We've got another one, objects, and this is more for more resonant maybe for museums, museum people, but objects and their tangibility provide a variety of stakeholders with an opportunity to debate the meaning and control of the memories. Artifacts are the touchstones that bring memories and meanings to life. So by discussing and analyzing these artifacts, you get a chance to actually open up a discussion about these, very similar as you would with any other primary source. And we're not going to go into there, but the process of looking at these, observe, analyze, and then kind of draw those conclusions. Imagine, figure it out. What are you going to be able to draw? What conclusions can you draw from this? So step one, the observation, really deeply look at various artifacts. That's the key there. Then bring in that next layer, analyzing the objects, asking questions, possibly doing extra research, if you're doing this in your classroom, into the time period and see what that brings into it. And then the students have to imagine, they have to put themselves in the place of the time period that these objects are coming from, the people who created them, the people who use them, and draw their conclusions based on their observations, based on that analysis that they've done. Here's a few of the questions that you can ask as you're looking at an artifact. Materials, very basic stuff. Start with the basics. What is it made out of? What can that tell us? Does it have a particular design? If so, why might it have been designed that way? Are there any markings? Are there anything on it? And especially when you're looking at historic artifacts, are those markings there? Are they intentional? Are they damaged from time over time? And are they original? If you're looking at something that's very, very old, you're probably not the first person looking at it. Something could have been added. Something could have been put on there, taken off. Things like that could be changed over time. And trying to get the context. Why would it have been made? What does it do? Is it purely artistic? Is it purely functional? Is it some combination of both? And then the context of who made it, and who made it? Why would they make it? Why would they make it the way they did? And what does that tell us about the society that created it? Now, you can switch to looking outward. That's kind of where we start to get into that. What does that tell us about the group that made it? How does that tell us about the history of the society around the object? But I think I'm going to stop sharing for just a second, and we're going to try this out. So, teachers, I've got a few objects here behind me, and let's take a quick look. All right. I've got this here. This is my object, and this is something we do with students. We actually do it virtually and in person. But this is my object that I found. We can see it working here. All right, teachers, either in the chat or feel free, please, to unmute and say it out loud if you'd like. What are some things we noticed material wise? And I know you can't touch it, you're just looking at it on a screen, but what is this made out of? All right, we've definitely got metal, especially on this part of it. Metal and wood, the handles are made out of wood, absolutely. Anything else? That should cover our materials. All right. Design features. What are you guys noticing about some of the design, the style of this? Any features or anything that you can see that you can look at that jumps out at you? All right, the metal's not flat right here. It's got a very purposefully designed wave in it, right? Handles are wooden. All right, the very thin rods there that you can see. I'll see if I can hold that a little closer as well. All right, it opens and closes, so it looks like it's obviously meant to hold something in between there, right? Or at least close on something. Now, we know that because the rods, it's got motion similar to, say, scissors that students would be familiar with, but nothing here is sharp enough to cut, so it can't be that. All right, design features. Any other notifications? Anything else we notice? Markings? Now, I will say with students, sometimes we get, now this is from our teaching collection. So some of this stuff was very old or collected a long time ago. So we get things like right there, we actually have a number that is written on the actual object. And a lot of times the students will catch that and they're like, oh, it has numbers on it. I'm like, yeah, that's the people who originally collected this wrote that on there so we could catalog it. We don't do that anymore. Write directly on artifacts is kind of a no-no. All right, the handles are pretty simple in design. Nothing super ornate. We have like the kind of bulge in the middle there that gives it a nice little curve. All right, so teacher, and we could keep going like this, but teachers and guests, what is this? What's the purpose? What does it do? It's a hair curler. That's right. If you wanted to curl or crimp your hair, this is what you would use. The handles are made of wood because to make this work, you're going to have to heat it up a little bit, get the metal nice and not scorching hot, but you're going to have to heat it up. But you're going to want wooden handles. That's going to allow you to be able to touch those without getting too burnt. But you can take your hair and press it in there, and you can get these nice designs in your hair. And you can run that through and kind of keep going down. I can't do it so much with mine, but you guys, this is something that we do today. We have hair curlers, hair flatteners, hair crimpers, I guess is still a thing. But this is a job that still gets done by a tool today. And honestly, it doesn't look wildly different than the one today as far as the basic components of it. Now, one question is, when would this have been used? Like I said, this is something that people could technically still use today, but I know it's older than that. 1920s. Pre-electricity. There's no plug. That gives us a time period, right? This, if I am correct, and this is not one of the ones I generally use, so I could be wrong. But if I'm correct, this is kind of turn of the century, late 1800, early 1900s. You're looking around into that time period. So yeah, you're not going to have a ton of electric appliances that you just plug in. Like I said, this is something you could hold over or near a fire, stick it in some coals to heat it up to the correct, or however hot you need it. And then you would go about using it. So what does this tell us about the society? Are there any conclusions I might be able to draw from the fact that they made this hair curler or hair crimper? All right, it does tell me that people had time to do their hair, to curl their hair, or at least occasionally do it. Maybe not, maybe this wasn't a daily tool. Women are going to wear their hair long enough, absolutely, to be able to curl it. And to a certain extent, style is important. The way your hair looked was important enough to have a tool specifically to get a look. If nobody cared about their hair, this is not something you'd probably find. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of, if not the society as a whole, the people who would have used this, maybe what it tells you little things about their lives. Now, with artifacts, and if we do this program with students virtually, what we do is we actually have several artifacts from around the same time period and we start to build. So this tells me a little bit, we pull out another one, it's going to tell me a little bit more, and we try to put those pieces together. But you guys, similar in your classroom, you can pull up these artifacts, talk about what this tells you about the time period. All right, now I'll see if I can go back to sharing my screen. Great job, guys. You figured it out. Is anybody about to trade in their curling iron for one of these? Yeah, that's fair. Okay. The other thing about artifacts is they tell multiple stories. They tell their own story. The artifacts themselves have a story. Now, the one I showed you, we don't have a lot of provenance for it. I don't specifically know where it came from. We don't know who owned it before that. That's one of the ways that it has ended up in our teaching collection. If it was owned by Sarah Polk, for example, it would not be in my hands down here. It's going to be out on display. So artifacts have their own stories. So where exactly did the artifact come from? And think about this in terms of you guys in your classroom. If you brought something from home, if you were going to do a similar activity, maybe you bring something that your grandmother, your great-grandmother owned. You bring that from home to share with your students and you do that same activity, that same type of activity. Well, that artifact has a story. It has a very important story to you, your family. You know about it. You know why it's been kept, why it was passed down to you. So these artifacts can very much have their own stories. And they connect people. Again, that's an object, the object we just looked at. I don't know how many of you do, but some of you may have a curling iron at home. But it lets you know that honestly, life may not have been that different in certain times, or at least not everything was different. Artifacts mean many things. Artifacts mean different things to different people. We're going to take a look at that a little more in depth here in just a second. And they capture moments. That's just like any primary source is going to, they really give you a snapshot of that time period, and they can easily reflect changes. Now, kind of looking at those, there it is. This is another artifact that is in the museum. I couldn't bring it down here to show you guys because it's on display and it's very large. That is a Conestoga wagon. So I'm just going to let's run through those 5, but in the terms of this artifact, this Conestoga wagon that we have here. They tell a story. This artifact, this Conestoga wagon, we do know where it came from. It was actually used by a family. This one is a little newer than probably what some of you may have thought. This was from the 1830s. And this was used by a family that moved from Tennessee to Texas and then back to Tennessee later on. And this was how they got there. They moved their stuff in this wagon. Now, some of it, the sideboards that you see there, most of the wagon is original. The wheels we have repaired and replaced various parts that were broken. The canvas we added to that, but the wagon itself moved this family. It tells their story of why they moved from Tennessee in the 1830s out to Texas, which was a common thing around that time period. There were a lot of people from Tennessee, Davy Crockett being one, Sam Houston moving out to those frontiers throughout the 1830s and 40s. Tennessee has started to settle. It is no longer the frontier, like a lot of people had moved into it, moved there for, and they continue to move out west. And then this family, like I said, does actually come back to Tennessee. Connecting people. When we have students come in, one of the things we ask them, like, hey, how many of you have ever moved? Have had to change houses or apartments or go from somewhere you were comfortable to somewhere new? And most of them have. That is a story that can connect with those students using this artifact. Artifacts meaning different things to different people. This wagon, depending on what population you are, let's say this is pre-statehood. Before 1796, Tennessee is not a thing, but there's a lot of people starting to move into the area using exactly the same kind of wagon right here. What would this wagon mean to white settlers that are moving into the area? Who thinks they could kind of put yourself in that place? What do you think this wagon might represent for those white settlers moving into this new frontier area? New opportunity, absolutely. A lot of people were moving here for various opportunities, whether it was to take care of their family, just start a little place of their own, or fresh start. Maybe not everything went super great back home. So go somewhere where you can start new, somewhere that's starting up. Land ownership is a big part of it. A lot of the early settlers that came into Tennessee were land speculators. Coming in to try and buy up or take control of large chunks of land. Or maybe wherever you're from, Virginia, North Carolina, wherever you're coming from, maybe you didn't have any land there and you can get cheap, easier access to land over here. So it's going to mean a lot of things. Now, if you're the Native American population, the Cherokee in East Tennessee, the Chickasaw in West Tennessee, and you see these wagons coming in, what is that going to mean to you? Trouble. It's one of the early thoughts, I'm guessing. So this wagon to Native Americans, it's a sign of trouble. Takeover. This, because it's also, especially the wagon, if you think of early long hunters who came into the area with the Native Americans, they came and they left. They hunted around, they stuck around for a little while, and then they left. This wagon means somebody's coming to stay. They are moving their stuff in. This is the start of white settlement in the area. And since Tennessee was entirely Native American land, the only place white settlers could live was on Native American land. So this is going to look like a takeover of their areas. And how about African Americans? What could this wagon possibly mean to African Americans in this area at this time? It could mean a lot of things. It could be seen as just an extension of enslavement because African Americans were brought into Tennessee. Not everybody that settled into Tennessee during the frontier period came by choice. It was not up to them. A lot of people, Virginia planters, North Carolina planters, came to start plantations on large tracts of land, and it expanded enslavement into this area. So a wagon like this might not be that freedom or that opportunity that the white settlers envisioned it as. So you can see that these artifacts can also give you different aspects based on who you are, what the background is. And they capture moments and they reflect change. Obviously, for looking back historically, this wagon tells us a lot about early settlement in Tennessee at a time of great change as white settlers are moving in and expanding into this area. All right, I can get this work. Now, I will say, I do want to point out limitations on using artifacts and things like that as primary sources in your classroom. I'm not saying artifacts are the perfect primary source to use. You do have to analyze and think critically about them. You can't just throw them up there. Basically, what I'm about to show you here is a wood engraving of a rhinoceros. Now, the person who did this, Albert Durer, I'm going to say that's how you pronounce it. He did a wood engraving of a rhinoceros, but he did it entirely by hearsay. He had never seen a rhinoceros. He was using other people's descriptions of them, written descriptions, and he was trying to come up with a picture to show an illustration. So this is not going to be the most accurate because he doesn't know. And that's what he came up with. Now, by looking at it, if somebody said, hey, what animal is this? Most of us would probably go with rhinoceros, but there's clearly some problems here. There's this weird little horn about where at base of his neck, where it meets his back, much more armor plated looking than we know a rhinoceros to look like now. It even almost looks like he's got a helmet on the face area there. So if this was a primary source you were looking at, you may get the impression that the people of this time period had no idea what a rhinoceros was, and a lot of them didn't. But this is also a primary source that, as it would have been used at the time, if this illustration is what got around and this is what people thought rhinoceroses were, they would be very surprised to see a real one. So there is a limitation to using certain primary sources. You cannot just say, take everything at face value. And this is a real wood engraving. This actually existed. This is in records places. But just to highlight the point and also to lighten the mood a little bit, here's a more humorous version of this. If any of you have ever read the book Motel of the Mysteries, it was written or published in '79, and basically this takes place way in the future. America has been buried in some kind of cataclysm, and an archaeologist finds an intact motel, and he opens up the room and he's cataloging it. And the book kind of talks about his finds as he discovers, and as he is analyzing the artifacts that he finds, as he is observing them, analyzing them deeply, and then he's drawing conclusions. The students that we bring in, they do this as well. They analyze, they observe, they draw conclusions. And sometimes without the context, their conclusions are not always the most accurate. For example, this is one of the pages from the book. One of the objects he finds in this motel is the sacred urn, clearly one of the most holy relics It was discovered in the inner chamber of the room, carved from a single piece of porcelain and highly polished. The urn was the focal point of the burial ceremony, and the ranking celebrant would kneel before the urn and chant into it while the water from the sacred spring flowed in there. So if you were to just find a bunch of our houses buried somewhere today, and you notice that every single one of them had 1, 2, maybe even 3 of these things in it, obviously it is going to mean that it's very important to everyone. There's a reason they have so many of them, and it's in every house. But it's easy for students, especially where they do not have a ton of context, especially if you're just learning about for the first time a historic period, that they're probably going to draw some wrong conclusions. Here at the museum, we don't mind that. As long as they're using the thought process and they're coming up with logical conclusions, that's really what we are going for with our programs. Now, we correct them and let them know what things are really. But honestly, everything that's seen here, like I said, is done for humor. This was not an actual archaeological find. And then there's another one here. These are done for humor, but you can logically see where these conclusions could have been drawn if you have an absence of other context to provide. So that is one piece of advice I give teachers as you want to use artifacts, especially in your classroom, as primary sources to help study the past. Make sure you know what they are. And if you don't, have the students do more research around the time period, because you don't want to accidentally run into these misdrawn conclusions that they possibly could get. And one last quote here. So as you are to consider the artifacts in your classroom, use them not only to understand the past, but also as a way to discuss the present, discuss what they meant to the people who made them and used them, but also what they meant to you. Your understanding of the artifacts, like a museum exhibit, a curator designs around them, is only the beginning, for artifacts tell many stories. Now, we've kind of talked about the importance of artifacts, and if you want to show in your class that book, like I said, it's the Motel of the Mysteries. You can find that on Kindle, if nothing else. And there's a lot more in it than that. But if you, does anybody have any questions for me right now before we kind of move on to the next bit? I've explained everything so thoroughly. No one has any questions. I'm that good. All right, excellent. Okay, so now the problem is, where do you get artifacts? So like I said, you can bring them from home. You can bring stuff from home that are around your house, especially if you have something meaningful to you. Obviously, you want to be careful with that. You don't bring anything into the classroom you don't want broken, is the general rule for teachers. So be very careful if you bring personal items. But you can have students do this with normal things, just stuff around the house. Water bottles can be used. A new thing like our masks that have popped up in society, and try to have them take a look at these objects from the perspective of someone in the future. And you can still get that thought process, that analyzation, that observation, and draw conclusions. So you can do this with stuff around the classroom or stuff you have at home. But if you are looking for different ways to use the artifacts, the Tennessee State Museum's website, tnmuseum.org, and the links to these are on that Padlet as well, so you can find them there. But I told you we started doing this because it was Tennessee's 225th anniversary. We actually have an online exhibit. If you go under exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, Tennessee at 225. Those 100 artifacts that I mentioned, they're here. You can go through and take a look and get high quality, good high def images of some of these artifacts. Click on them. This is a moccasin, a woodland period moccasin, which is very rare. Usually things made of organic fiber like this one, plant fiber, don't generally last this long. This just happened to be perfectly preserved in a cave, and we managed to we managed to be able to take care of it once it was donated to us. But you can get some basic information on it, and it tells you a little bit about how we got it, just who it was donated by, that kind of stuff, what gallery it could be found in. But you have some very basic information about it, and then the image itself. You could pull these up with your students. Let's see, try to hit some others. The gallery over here, you can see we have different time periods. Tennessee Transforms. Let's jump to more modern. All right. So William Franklin Lyle's Medal of Honor. You can talk about that. Let's pull up this one. The I Like Ike campaign dress that we have on display here at the museum. And you can talk about the fashion of the day, and a little bit slightly different than ours, but political, excuse me, political campaigns. You can talk about the different ways people advertise who they want to vote for. And that could also lead into the time period, the politics of the time period. Eisenhower, who was he? What was he campaigning on? What was going on in the time period as well? We have a trunk here. This crate was shipped from Czechoslovakia to the National Council of Jewish Women in Nashville, Tennessee. And this was, we use this to discuss immigration during this time period in Tennessee. And you can see Nashville written out here, Tennessee. Both are misspelled by English standards. But if you're Czechoslovakian or writing in a different language, that's not too bad as far as the spelling of that goes. So we use this one to highlight the immigration story from the 1950s after World War II. So you can see that, get a little bit of information. This one's from 1949. So we have these here. Everybody loves Dolly Parton, so I'll pull up her pantsuit real quick. Dolly Parton's pantsuit, worn in a show. She's actually in the standards. But get a little bit of history on her. These are the 100 artifacts we chose for this exhibit, but you also can go to search our collection. If you go under exhibits and collections, does anybody have a preference, something, a keyword of Tennessee history you'd like me to search for and see what we might possibly have? Which could get me in trouble. Look at somebody could find a term that we don't actually have something for. All right, what do you guys want me to search for? Prohibition. Provided I spelled that correctly. All right, so you can search our collection, and this is a much wider, like I said, that 225, that's a specific 100 artifacts. This is a much wider look at our Prohibition collection that we have here, that our collection in general. And you can go through and, oh, Tommy gun. That's kind of weird. But I didn't know we had this one. But hey, if you want to tell the gangster story of Prohibition, we've got a Tommy gun right there. You can definitely pull that up. We have bottles that would have been used for moonshine or various alcohol distillers. And I knew I had one here somewhere. 18th Amendment, repeal the 18th Amendment license plate. And the Old Hickory Carmack Club, Edward Carmack was a well-known prohibitionist in Nashville and Tennessee during the time period. He actually gets killed in a shootout in the downtown Nashville, not because of his prohibition. He didn't get along with a lot of people. But you have a banner there, a pro-prohibition banner that we have there. So you guys can look stuff up through this and use these images as well. The other thing you guys can use resource-wise for our, if you're looking for artifacts, is our trunk program. If any of you are familiar with the trunk program or have used it in the past, then you know where I'm going with this. But if you haven't, our traveling trunk program, this is something that we send out to schools. And it has objects in it. Now, a lot of them are replicas for various reasons. We have a lot of replica artifacts in here, but you can use them to do some of the same things. But we do try to, where we can, include actual artifacts. I'm actually going to start with our newest trunk that we just finished creating for this school year. The 3 R's of Reconstruction: rights, restrictions, and resistance. This one specifically takes a look at the African-American experience of Reconstruction. And it looks at it through those 3 lenses. So each group, the way that this one works is in your class, you would divide your kids up into 4 groups. Each group takes a specific right. One group looks at the right to vote. One group looks at the right to move and choose where you're going to live. One group looks at the right to an education. And one group looks at the right to a family, to have a family, which was new after enslavement ends in Tennessee. And you follow that. So the first day of the activity, you're looking at those rights. You dig in and you study those rights. The second day, you look at restrictions that are placed on those rights. And then the third day, you look at resistance. How do people push back against those restrictions? And what you are actually looking at is primary sources. We gathered things, Tennessee-specific primary sources. Some of them are text, some of them are images, and some of them are 3D objects. But your students will get those sources and they will analyze those at each step of the way. The idea at the end is each group, since they've only studied one right, their goal is to design a museum exhibit in your classroom that would help teach the other groups about what they were studying, what they learned. And then you can have your students do kind of a museum gallery walk through the classroom and present to each other at the end of each day what they've learned. This is one of the ones that does have an actual artifacts. We have actual textbooks from the 1870s that we put in there that your students can look at. We encourage them not to actually pull them out and flip through them. But because they won't last very long that way, but your students will have the opportunity to see actual textbooks from the time period, as well as a lot of other replica artifacts. With any one of our trunks, if you guys are interested in them, you can download the lesson plans directly from the website, so you can see exactly what we suggest you do with the trunks and if it's going to fit into your standards. So this one, we kind of have, like I said, how the groups would be divided up and what they're going to be talking about on each section, each day of the activity. And I'm going to zoom through basic procedures for each activity and some graphic organizers to help your students as they are analyzing these, including a place to put journal entries about the various primary sources they're looking at are available as well. So our trunk program is another good way to get a hold of artifacts and objects that you can use in the classroom. And the last one I want to point out, is another way, and this is a little roundabout, but if you go to the kids section of our website and go to the Junior Curators blog, one thing that we did when the museum shut down due to COVID, but we still wanted to reach out and provide resources for not only teachers, but parents that were suddenly having to work with their students at home. We wanted to provide good Tennessee history-based resources for them. So we created a kids blog where we write actual blog entries about Tennessee topics that are written at a student's level. We aim for about 5th grade as far as the writing goes. And I'm just going to go to some of our earlier ones. We tried to do a mixture of just purely written blogs, very similar to what you would see in any other blog site, but also fun ones. We have a Civil War quiz that you can take there as well. Gardening for Victory, talking about victory gardens after World War II or during World War II. And basically, these are going to have a literacy component, an ELA component, an actual written somewhere around 500 to 700 word blog. But every one of them is also going to have images of artifacts from our collections that you could also use if you're looking for primary sources as well. So this is a booklet we actually have in our collection talking about victory gardens. let's see, another cookbook for use with your victory gardens. Every one of them, all the written ones, the ones that are quizzes and more fun don't have these, but all the written ones also have vocabulary. If we use any words in there that we think might be something the students are unfamiliar with, we've defined it for them. So you have that. We also put comprehension questions that go along with it. So you don't have to think of them on your own in your classroom. And then we always try to include something where either a suggested activity that could be done at home with kids or possibly in your classroom, or sometimes it's just another place to look for more information, but we try to include that. So we have, for example, here, one of those in one of the cookbooks recipes, we included that. So you could try making this yourself at home. And then we include any state standards that we think might be, that we think that that blog relates to, which does double duty that if on our website, if you go to the search bar and type in just the state standard 5.20 in this case, it'll actually pull this up. So if you're looking for something specifically for a certain standard, you can see if we've already written a blog about it. Oh, this is one of mine, the H.L. Hunley. We try to tell more unique stories. You're not going to find a ton of blogs in here, for example, about Andrew Jackson, because there's lots of places you can get Andrew Jackson information. So we wanted to start from the other end, maybe some of the stories that are a little harder to find. This one is about the first submarine that ever took down an enemy vessel. It was actually designed by a Tennessean. It was not super successful. Lots of people died during the testing of it, including Hunley, the designer himself. And it did take down the enemy vessel. It did actually work. It sank a Union ship, but it also sank the Hunley as well. It didn't get far enough away from the explosion before it happened. But again, you can see this is a bust. We actually have a Hunley in our collection, a model of the Hunley that we have in our collection. So you can see these artifacts there as well. And any teachers that are here with us, I encourage you to share with us other topics that you would like to see. If you want to go through our blogs, feel free to do that. And if there's something you just don't see you think should be covered, let us know. We're still constantly adding new ones to this. You can search these, like I said, through the main search tool on the website. You can go by dates that they were published. We also tag them. So if you're looking for something specifically about women's history, we have that tag. Jacksonian, Tennessee, we have that tag, and it'll give you the ones that we have here. This is a great series where we actually interviewed a historian from the Chickasaw. It's actually a three-parter where we interviewed them about their history and culture here in Tennessee and got their responses from that. All right, we have a little bit of time left, so any questions you guys have for me about any of the stuff we discussed? And that can be some of these resources that I've shared, or any of the discussions, or anything that what we do with students here, talking about artifacts as well. Which of course is another resource you can use. You can bring your students on a field trip to the State Museum and we can show them our actual stuff. We encourage that as well. The trunk program, how does that work for educators? Excellent. I'll go back to the main trunk page here. Basically, what you would do is, and we have multiple trunks for each topic, but you can see across the side here what topics we have. We actually have 12, I believe, counting the new Reconstruction one. We have one on financial literacy, from barter to budget. We know that economics is part of the social studies lesson, so we created one for that. Life and Time of First Tennesseans. Like I said, so you can click on one of those. You can download the lesson plans to make sure it's something you would be interested in your classroom. If it is, your next step would be to request a reservation. And there's some frequently asked questions here. Cost. We don't have a rental fee. You don't have to, or a reservation fee. And we pay the shipping to you as well. So the only cost to you would be shipping it back to us. But currently, right now, what we are doing is, if you are in Davidson County or one of the counties that touch Davidson County, you do pay the shipping back to us, or you can bring it back physically, just bring it to the museum. That would be completely free. Otherwise, you pay the shipping through FedEx. If you are outside of those counties, we actually provide you a prepaid label so you can ship the trunk back to us at no cost as well. So depending on where you are, or if you're willing to drive into the museum, you can make this entirely free. You ask for a reservation using our online reservation form. The reservations are 3 weeks long. That does include the shipping. So you lose 2 or 3 days on the front and the back end because it takes a couple of days to get to you, a couple of days to get back to us. But that leaves you with about a week and a half to use the actual trunk. We suggest taking a couple of days to go through the trunk, familiarize yourself with the materials, and then about a week or so to actually go through the lessons with the students. But basically, you pack that back up, you put that prepaid label on it, and you call FedEx. They will come by and pick it up, and it gets shipped back to us. So if you want to reserve a trunk, you can do that. We have multiple of each topic, so there's pretty good availability. Obviously, certain trunks are more popular at certain times based on standards and what teachers are teaching in their classroom. Our one on slavery and for example, our Reconstruction trunk are both getting filled up for February for Black History Month. A lot of teachers are asking for those. So you can imagine there are certain times of year where some of them are a little more popular than others. The only thing that we kind of ask is try not to lose anything and try to get it back to us on time because we do the reservations basically back to back. So if you're a teacher that has a trunk, there's probably a teacher that has it right behind you. So if you guys can get it back to us on time, that means we can get it to the next teacher on time as well. You can use it for multiple classes. And if you let us know that ahead of time, we might, I'm not going to promise anything, but we might be able to give you a little extra time with it. If you say, oh, my entire grade level is going to use this, that's 5 teachers. We may be able to squeeze an extra week out of that, so you have a little bit more time to use it in your school. If you guys have specific questions about how the trunks work, I'll gladly answer those as well, like any certain thing you're curious about. We have a video here that kind of goes in and explains some of that as well. Any other questions? All right, well, if you don't have any other questions, then I'm going to quiz you one more time on an artifact. And we're going to see how you do. Let's see. I'm going to use a bigger one. All right, here we go. We've got another artifact. You guys remember those questions that we went through as far as the material goes, the analyzing questions. So I want you to think about those questions, keep them in your mind as you look at this artifact. It is made of wood. All right, so we've got our material. It's basically entirely made out of wood. I think there's one hand-hewn nail in it, actually. Looks like a pogo stick. All right, so first of all, I'm holding it this way a lot. Is this the top or the bottom of it? What do you guys think? It is the bottom. And you guys, whoever said pogo stick, probably getting that from the fact that there are handles, and you're absolutely right. If you thought those were handles, they are indeed. Somebody said they attended a workshop. You already got it. There we go. So it does have handles, and you're absolutely right. That is what those are. Those are handles. So basically what you're saying is I would need to hold it here. This is the bottom. So what do I do with it? What is this for? Yeah, you could, the flat part, you could easily step on that. There is room for feet on there, especially as a kid. If you're thinking of pogo stick for a child's toy, I'm not going to jump on this because that's a problem. Plus, it's not a pogo stick. But it has that look, right? It looks like something we might, I mean, your students might be familiar with, but it's not that thing. So that's gonna, talking about students drawing conclusions. And one thing I always warn students about is try not to immediately guess what something is. Because if you immediately guess at what it is, you're gonna make all of your analyzation questions give you that answer. You're gonna make sure they all lead that direction. Looks like it could be separated. That's also something we, one of the questions I work with students. Does it look like it's the whole thing? Does it look like it comes in pieces? Does it look like it's a piece of a larger whole? That is something that that we look at, and one of the examples I give them is an Xbox. If you've got an Xbox, you've probably got a controller. Those two things have to go together, but they are their own individual pieces. Sometimes artifacts are the same way. It could be an entire thing, but you need something else before you could use it. Would butter churns have had those legs? I actually have a butter churn up here as well. And that does not have the legs, but it does have that press on the inside there. But you're close. It's from a similar time period, and it is for a chore. It does look like a stool. That's always my thing. The bottom looks like a stool. This is actually, does anybody want to give a guess? I'm not just going to reveal. Anybody want to guess? Agitator, absolutely right. This is an agitator for a washing machine, basically. You're the washing machine. If you had a bucket of sudsy water, you throw your clothes in there, you put this down in there, and you just turn it back and forth. The legs are going to operate to churn the water up. It'll move the clothes around as they go, and you can just sit there and agitate the water in your washing machine. So in a way, like I said, similar to a butter churn, you're going to stand there and you're going to actually use this as a chore, and it's from about the same time period as you would see butter churns like the one I showed you there as well. And one of the things, like I said, if we combine these together, let's say we put this with the butter churn with some of the other things, you're going to start to see a lot of these tools tell you about chores, about life on the frontier. What kind of jobs had to be done around the house? That's a job we have a machine for today. But also the fact that they're all made out, most of them are going to be made out of wood. Wood was a readily available material. It was a lot easier to work with. It was cheap compared to getting things made out of metal. You had to have a certain skill to be able to make something out of metal. So that gives us a sense of the society and the culture at the time. All right, so that was my last quiz, and I think we're coming right up on the hour mark as of right now. So unless you guys have any questions for me, I want to say thank you very much for having me in and sitting and listening to me this whole time.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for that. I know I learned several things. I had never seen an agitator like that before, so that's really cool. So a couple things as we wrap up, just a quick reminder for you guys again, we do have that Padlet where you can find some of the links that we saw today. And we will be posting the recording of this. So if you want to share that with any of your colleagues, that will be available tomorrow. Also, we will have a survey. So if you are interested in getting PD credit for today's session, feel free to go to this link and complete that survey. Certificates are sent out about once a week. So once you fill that out, you should get a certificate within a week. For those of you attending live, we'll drop the link in the chat box here in just a second. And so that you'll be able to fill it out there. And lastly, we have another webinar in this series next month on January the 11th, and that one will be presented by the Tennessee State Library and Archives. If you have not already registered for that session, you can, of course, do that by the same way that you registered for today's session. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to us. We have 3 more presentations in this series for the year. So we will run this through March. And of course, on that form where you sign up for this one, you can sign up for the February and March sessions as well. Again, thank you guys so much for joining us again today. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you next month.